In the years between 1880 and 1910, a great race arose among explorers to see who would explore the North Pole first. Some tried to claim the Arctic for fame, others for education and scientific study, and others simply to be the first. These expeditions proved that all the corners of the earth were conquerable, but the means by which it was done was not always admirable. The North Pole, a race to explore. From the beginning, Robert Peary knew he was destined for fame. Raised in Maine, Peary attended Bowdoin College and later graduated in 1877. After he left school, Robert enrolled for a job in the U.S. Navy as an engineer, and in his pursuit of service, Peary found, browsing through a bookstore, a newfound pastime. Peary became thirsty for a trip through Greenland's icy landscape. Peary soon found himself in Washington, D.C., preparing for a trip to Niagara to continue a survey for the Maritime Canal Company. It was in D.C. that he met a man named Matthew Henson and hired him as a personal servant for his future expedition. After 2 trips to Niagara, Peary married Josephine Dibish in 1888. Soon after, he prepared an initial expedition to the north with Matthew Henson, Josephine, his new wife, 3 other men, and a physician named Dr. Frederick Cook. From that experience, Peary turned feverish with the idea of reaching the North Pole before any other men. Peary prepared tirelessly, gathering supplies, money, and fellow explorers to help him on the journey. When Matthew Henson once again accompanied Peary, Frederick Cook chose otherwise, and the 3 parted separate ways on the path of exploration. On his 3rd attempt in 1909, Peary reached the topmost part of the world. Upon his return home, Peary soon found out that his old friend Frederick Cook had already claimed the North Pole but a year earlier. Flustered by this surprise, Peary took the matter to court for clarification on who actually got there first. The government eventually agreed that Robert Peary had come closer to the pole than Cook, and therefore was the first and closest person to reach the North Pole. Frederick Cook had a rough start in his exploring career. After graduating from New York University Medical School in 1890, Cook's wife and baby died in childbirth. Crushed emotionally, he tried to escape through books of exploration and travel. A year later, he heard of one Robert Peary gathering volunteers for an expedition to Greenland. Cook joined him. Upon the completion of the first expedition, Peary wanted to take another crack at the Arctic, but Cook declined due to a contract which prohibited all explorers to share anything about the trip. After departing from Peary, Frederick Cook took partial journey to the Antarctic and later 2 attempts to scale Mount McKinley in Alaska. He became the first to do it in 1906. Ready to explore the North Pole, Cook set off from Massachusetts in 1907, heading towards Greenland first. Pressing on through bitter wind, Cook's party decreased dramatically but found the closest spot to the North Pole as possible in 1908, or so they thought. Cook assumed he was moving in an eastern direction with the ice, but simultaneously was heading westward and ended up 100 miles of his destination. Upon his return to Greenland, Cook met an Arctic hunter named Harry Whitney. Whitney explained to Cook that many people thought him dead and that Peary had set off to find the North Pole 8 months earlier. Before Cook left Enoatok, a small hunting station in Greenland, one of the 2 natives who were to accompany him back home had to stay behind due to illness, thus forcing Cook to leave a sledge behind. Whitney advised Cook to leave behind anything that he didn't need on the way back to the U.S. Cook left behind his journal, scientific data, and instruments. As Cook was en route to Copenhagen, Whitney crossed paths with Peary, who offered him a ride from Greenland on the Roosevelt. Whitney agreed. Once Peary found out about Frederick Cook finding the North Pole first, Peary demanded that anything which belonged to Cook be taken off the ship. Harry Whitney had agreed to bring Frederick Cook's educational records back to the U.S. Because of Peary's stipulations for Whitney to have passage, Whitney stowed Cook's possessions by some rocks on the shore before continuing south with Peary. Once the Roosevelt arrived in Maine, Peary and Cook had a heated debate as to who really found the North Pole. Due to the loss of Cook's journals and scientific data, he was criticized and accused of lying. He was later sent to prison for being accused of trying to swindle his way to the top. Like Frederick Cook, Matthew Henson encountered many trials, but in his youth. Born in Maryland, Matthew Henson became an orphan when he was 11 years old, and at 13 he started working for a ship based in Maryland as a cabin boy. Henson first met Perry in Washington, D.C. when he was working as a store clerk, and as Perry was preparing for his trip to Niagara. Perry then hired Henson as a valet for later expeditions. Henson joined Perry's first Greenland expedition in 1890 and continued with him for years. He also accompanied Perry on the fateful journey to the North Pole in 1909. Quote, "It'll work," said Henson, "if wind leads, ice, snow, and all the struggles of this frozen land are willing." End quote. Each explorer had differing motivations for finding the North Pole. Some explorers wanted to find the North Pole because they were thirsty for fame. Others took on the conquest to learn and conduct scientific study for themselves or others, while there were still others who trekked into the Arctic for the sheer thrill of it.
You know, when George Mallory was a famous British explorer, and he was asked, and he's raising money to go climb Mount Everest, and he was asked at one point, "Why do you want to do this?" And he says, "Because it's there." And I think often that's just simple enough, is that that it's something that no one's done, and so I want to do it.
Perry was desperate for fame. He didn't want, quote, "to live and die without accomplishing anything or without being known beyond a narrow circle of friends," end quote. Perry's goal to be the first to reach the North Pole turned into obsession. When he came across a book written by a Greenland explorer and his travels in the Arctic, Perry was reminded of his boyhood dreams. In a letter to his mother, Perry said, quote, "I must have fame, and I cannot reconcile myself to years of commonplace drudgery," end quote. He would not quit until he had accomplished what he had set his heart to years and years before. Cook was motivated to explore the North Pole because of how his trials forced him to find a way to distract himself. Matthew Henson was driven to explore the Arctic out of joy and pleasure. Each explorer encountered various trials and hardships along the way, but eventually they were able to overcome them in the end. One of the many trials that two of the explorers encountered was the loss of family and loved ones. Frederick Cook would not have met Perry except that heartache and loneliness that led him to high-risk explorations. Though Cook's hard work never paid off as he had hoped, he was able to gain experience as an explorer and traveler. He learned many things through the trials he encountered. Without the loss of his parents, Matthew Henson wouldn't be working in a shipyard at age 11, which later led to introductions with Robert Perry. These trials of loss shaped these men and helped them press on and gain grit. Another major trial that each of these explorers had to face was one another. Upon his return, Perry was upset at the knowledge that his old companion had reached the North Pole before him, igniting his pride and desire for fame and glory. Finding hard to keep what he thought was his, Perry eventually took the matter to the U.S. House of Representatives, who concluded that Perry had reached the North Pole first.
I think probably until the later 20th century, I'm not sure that the impact was enormous, because the environment there is just so hostile. It's difficult for humans to actually do much there at all.
Perhaps Perry saw in his mind's eye the future of the world once he had passed on. Could it be that when he spoke of fame, he wasn't merely considering his present day, but also his own legacy? Certainly, an explorer with his claim of reaching the North Pole first would live on for future generations of explorers. His adventures were the literature of history textbooks, and if people read and saw that the ends of the earth were conquerable, and that he had done it, then it must be so. Frederick Cook wanted to leave a lasting impact, not simply for the sake of inspiring future explorers, but to show that even the northernmost point on the earth held valuable resources which could contribute to the subjects of science, geography, and political gain. Faced with many challenges, Perry, Henson, and Cook explored harsh environments, encountered trials, and exchanged in the currency of adventure pursuits. Though their reasoning and goals differed, these men proved that if one presses forward with determination, persistence, and a bit of grit, one can achieve the seemingly impossible.